Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to The Future of Education. Tonight is Tuesday night, September 28th, 2010, and we're delighted to have Paul Peterson from Harvard on the line. Professor Peterson, welcome.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be with you tonight.
Would you like to be called Professor, Doctor, Paul? What's your preference?
Paul is just fine, Steve.
Thanks so much. The Future of Education is sponsored by Illuminate and Learn Central. Illuminate, as many of you know, has now been subsumed into the Blackboard family. The logoing hasn't fully crossed over yet. You're soon going to see Blackboard logoing here. But Learn Central is the social network for educators that I work on for Illuminate. It is a free social network that has Illuminate baked in, and we hope you'll come and use it and take advantage of its ability to connect you with other educators. Coming up in November, our free Global Education Conference, 5 days, November 15th to 19th, multiple time zones, multiple languages, multiple tracks, and all free with an emphasis on inclusion. We have lots of really great people from all over the world who are going to participate, and hope that you will, if you're so inclined, sign up to present, or just come and take in some sessions. Coming up on the Future of Education, Thursday, Ben Daly from High Tech High. October 4th, next Monday, a special 2-hour session with Edutopia and Deborah Meyer, Gary Steger, Alfie Cohn, and several others talking about elevating the ed policy discussion. On October 7th, we're going to hear from DiMartino and Walk on the personalized high school. Then Sylvia Martinez, Roger Shank, Kathleen Cushman comes back with her students this time. Nancy White to talk about networks and communities. You'll see the rest of the list there. The most recent addition is Matt Levinson, who'll talk about his book, From Fear to Facebook. And then on December 9th, as fate would have it, Julie Young from Florida Virtual School will be our guest, and you're going to hear about her tonight. If you've missed a Future of Education session, they are recorded. They're up at futureofeducation.com. The Montessori High School session we did on place-based education, that recording is up. Charles Fidel on 21st Century Skills in STEM. George Siemens on connectivism. The intriguing BYU Idaho learning model. Lots of other fun there. I hope you'll find something. Kathleen Dweck continues to pull in good listenership from that fascinating session, as well as Linda Darling-Hammond. So from the other coast, from the Harvard of the West, Stanford, we did have 2 fun guests a couple of weeks ago. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is a participative environment. We hope that you will find ways to participate, and especially to ask questions as we move to Q&A. You have the participant window. I'm going to recommend that you go up to View Layouts and switch to the wide layout. It does make it much easier to see the chat. You can leave messages in the chat area. There is a drop-down box to send a private message, but do know that as the moderator, I do see all those private messages, so they're not fully private. You can raise your hand. That's the hand with the green up arrow. You can use the smiley face or the clapping hand to indicate how you're feeling. And right now, I'm going to give you a chance to modify this map to let us know where you're listening from. You can also put a plug for your location, maybe the time and the temperature in the chat. Look for the wand to the left of the map, click on it, and then click on the map. And no surprise tonight, we are U.S.-centric. I don't think that should be any surprise given the topic. Connie Weber. Connie, great to have you here. Rainy, cool, early fall in Michigan. Another Michigan. Calva Mom, cold and rainy, warm and drizzly in Connecticut. We're having record triple digits here in California. An early Indian summer, or just a late summer. We do have someone from Australia. Nathan, glad to have you here. Wherever you're participating from, or if you're listening to the recording, we're sure glad to have you here, as we are to have Paul Peterson here. So Paul, I really loved this book, and I felt a little bit intimidated by it because there was a lot of content that I was unfamiliar with, and you have a sort of a deep grasp of each of the personalities profiled. Could you give us a short description of the structure of the book and why you wanted to structure it this way?
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be with you, and it's very rainy out here in Massachusetts. this evening. The book itself is focused on the history of American education. I've read a lot of histories of American education, but I think that they've never really captured exactly why schools are the way they are today. You've had some that celebrate the fact that American schools got better and better and beat the world for a very long period of time, and you've had others that worried about the schools imposing the cultural values of the elite on the rest of the population. But I don't think either of those perspectives quite got at what really interested me, which was how was it that our schools always wanted to customize education ever since John Dewey wrote. And I tell stories about John Dewey in the book. Ever since John Dewey wrote, we wanted child-centered education. We wanted to reach children where they are. And we've never been able to do it very well. One example of that is individualized education plans for every disabled child, which was part of federal legislation back in 1974. Individual education for each child. That's a great idea, a great plan. It makes sense for every child, not just for the disabled child. But we didn't get that. What we got was a lot of regulations and a lot of rules and a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of central powers. So power in American education, and I have to confess, Steve, that I'm a political scientist, so I tend to look at things from a political perspective. How is politics shaping our educational system? And the way it has happened historically, in my view at least, is that we've had very wonderful people with visions for the future, but their visions didn't turn out right. I mean, we started with Horace Mann. That's the first character that I described in this book, and he wanted to have an educational system that would reach every person in the country. And even more important was John Dewey, comes later on and develops the concept of child-centered education. Then we have Martin Luther King, who tries to desegregate our schools, but ironically, we've never gotten that desegregation. Instead, we got a lot of other rights movements that were really quite different. And we had Al Shanker, a trade union leader, who thought that if you could somehow organize teachers into unions, that somehow that would transform the schools. And I don't think his vision ever was realized. The person who I find really very interesting is James Coleman, who was at the University of Chicago back in the 70s. I met him when I was an assistant professor there, and he actually identified something that was a problem in the modern school, and that he basically said students at school feel like they're in jail, that there are these people who are giving them orders, and nobody really cares about them, and so they form peer group relationships that are built around the sports activities and adolescent life instead of focusing on educational matters. And so there's always this conflict between the people running the school and the inmates at the school, he said. And I found his ideas very, very interesting. So when I get to the end of the book, I say, well, how are we going to change this? How are we going to take this highly regulated, top-down educational system that has gradually developed? Nobody planned it. Nobody said this is the way it should be. It wasn't that way at the beginning. How are we going to get back to our original vision of what education was all about? And it occurred to me that some new things that are happening in American education today, digital learning, have an incredible promise, giving us finally an opportunity to focus on each child and to pinpoint where everybody is and what level of learning they have reached, and then to bring them as fast as possible to higher levels of learning. So actually instruction can be at what I call the price point being the particular level of accomplishment a student is at any given point in time.
So part of the reason that I found the book so fascinating was that there's this theme throughout it of kind of unintended consequences, and for each reformer that you profile, you give a very personal history. Was there purpose to getting so personal about each of the reformers?
Well, part of it was my feeling that everybody's own educational experience informs how they think about things. And I actually tell some stories about myself at the very beginning, just to show the reader that, I'm willing to shine the light on myself a little bit. But yes, I think in the case of Horace Mann, he had a conversion experience as a young boy. He was brought up in a very orthodox tradition, fire and brimstone, and he was afraid he was going to go to hell. And one day he was had a conversion and realized, God is good, and I don't have to believe this. And this motivated him to become a missionary, but a missionary for the public schools. And really his goal was to drive orthodox thinking out of the public educational system. And it was quite pervasive back in the colonial period and the early 19th century world that Horace Mann was reacting to. So that's one example of it. And in the case of James Coleman, who I just mentioned, to come to the more recent person, his early life, he went to a school in Lexington, Kentucky, and at that school he found out that he was focusing more on football because the classroom experience was just totally boring, and the teachers didn't care whether he learned or not. And that's where he developed his ideas that later on would say, there's something about the whole way we structure our school system where you compete against one another. The students are competing against one another in the classroom, and they don't like it. And so the student who's really doing very well is resented by the rest of the students, and you get what's called nerd harassment. Well, he had gone through that himself. And then we come down to Julie Young at Florida Virtual School, who's going to be on your show in a few weeks, and I think you'll find her totally fascinating because when she was a child, she was bullied at school. And even to this very day, when one of the things she loves about the Florida Virtual School is that if anybody's being bullied at their local school, they can escape that by taking courses online. We just had an incident here in New England where a father rode the bus because his disabled child was being beaten up on the bus, and he tried to do something about it and became quite a story in the local newspaper. Well, it occurred to me that that's exactly the kind of situation where having an option out there where students could take their learning online, families would love to be able to have that option under some circumstances.
What the personal stories did for me was kind of interesting. It allowed me to see the history of the reform movement and the history of education in a much more human way, and to feel a little bit sort of the quirks and foibles of those different views, and to kind of relax a bit about declaring sort of one core set of beliefs about education. I'm not quite sure why it did that, but I think it was because there was the sense that these were human beings who were imperfect in their own ways, and whose efforts often led to things other than what they would have themselves wanted.
Well, it's sort of interesting when you think about L. Shanker in New York City, who really wanted to become a philosopher. He had studied John Dewey. He was at the Columbia University, and then he wasn't able to finish writing his dissertation because he didn't have much money. He came from a very poor family, or his father sold newspapers for a living. They were immigrants. His mother worked as a seamstress in a seamstress factory, so they were just on the edge of poverty. This was during the Depression years, and he managed to get to Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York City, the exam school there. So he being a very bright kid, managed to get into a wonderful school. But he had so many challenges just because of the fact that he didn't have the kind of income other people had. And so he ends up teaching in East Harlem and finds out that he didn't like it there. It wasn't a very good experience. He had these principals and administrators ordering him around, not sensitive to the needs of the students. So he joined the union, and he began to see as his cause teachers should be able to take charge and take control of their own situation. And in that way, we will create a wonderful educational system. But as it turned out, later on in his life, he looks back at it and he finds that he's created an organization which, although very powerful, has not provided teachers with the autonomy and control over their own teaching situation that he had expected it would when he began.
So it also felt to me like the book describes a move toward more and more control that, again, wasn't necessarily intended, but that with each successive stage of education reform led to more and more centralized control. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, it starts off, if you look back in the 19th century, you had school boards were very large, school districts were very small, you had the little red schoolhouse, you had the one-room school. Gradually, the school districts get bigger. Gradually, you bring in more and more professional people to run them. The community leaders who were deeply involved at the beginning get pushed to one side. The state begins to pass laws that says this is the way the schools shall be run in our state. State funding becomes much more important, and a lot more money goes into education as a result. But the local resources that were so crucial for schools in the early years become less significant. And then finally you get to the increasing role of the federal government, and I think it all culminates in No Child Left Behind, which very few people feel comfortable with, this idea that the federal government is going to come up with a set of rules by which the educational system is going to be run in the country as a whole. And even though the federal law doesn't really control everything that happens in a classroom, everybody feels constrained by it in a way that really is totally contrary to the tradition of American education.
I was reminded of a conference that many of us attend each year called EduCon, and it's a conference created by educators for educators, and it largely ends up being kind of a place for teachers and educators to voice their interest in policy changes. I'm also struck by the fact that often they want to change the system, but they don't want to change the control. They would like to have more control, but they'd keep the system the same. Does that come up as well?
It does. I mean, the way that I see we need to go in the future is to put the student in charge. Because if we put the student in charge, everybody has to worry about serving the student. And it won't be students being told what to do by adults, but it'll be students selecting the material that is appropriate for them at a particular point in time. Now, this is pretty radical stuff. And I don't think it really could possibly have been done even 10 years ago. But with the new technologies that are coming online and the new ones that are being invented almost daily, it's going to be possible to create courses that will, and also to find out from students exactly, okay, how much do they know at this particular point in time? Is it time to introduce fractions, or is it time to teach long division, or is it time to go on to your geometry lesson, or what kind of background in science do you have, or what's your historical knowledge, and then you can provide a course specific to that person. I'm also very excited about the possibility that colleges and universities can now begin to construct courses that are going to be available to kids in high school and even in middle school. So the whole distinction between going to college and going to middle school and high school will break down, and you'll have the capacity to bring the finest people in the world backed up by the finest technology produced by the most sophisticated companies in the world to produce courses that have a presentation value that is comparable to what we get from Hollywood films. So all of that is possible in education, and it makes the current moment very exciting.
So there's a point in the book at which you you're part of a group releasing a report, and you're accused of promoting a particular politician's election, and a Republican's election, and you make the point in the book that at the time you were all Democrats. But as a political science person, you obviously are watching, as you said, politics closely. Do people ever look at your sort of optimistic conclusions here and draw connections maybe with the work you've done with Hoover or other work and put you in a category of saying that you're trying to promote something?
Well, the most interesting thing about digital learning is how widespread public enthusiasm is for that. The journal that I am the editor of, Education Next, which is produced here at Harvard and also at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and it's a joint effort. What we do is we conduct a poll of the American public, a nationally representative poll of the American public every year. And the last 2 years, we've asked a question, do you think students should be able to take courses online? High school students should be able to take courses online and apply them to your high school diploma. And last year, in 2009, 42% said yes, they favored that, which I thought was a very high number because we gave people the opportunity to say, I don't know, I have no opinion on this, and about 25% said that. So those people who were supporting it were twice as many as the percentage opposing it. That was last year. This year, that 42% went up to 52%, which is a huge shift in public opinion in one year. On most of the questions we ask, if we ask, what do you think about merit pay for teachers, you get the same answer year after year. Or if we ask a question like, what do you think of No Child Left Behind, the opinion doesn't change very much from one year to the next. But on this one, there's a big move in public opinion, and actually the Democrats among the people we polled are more in favor of this idea than the Republicans. So I don't see this as a partisan issue. I see this as a big issue that has widespread public support and openness to the idea.
Which is obviously what's needed for some larger change to take place, is some kind of consensus around a non-divisive idea that would allow movement to take place. Do you want me to go now to that slide, what you were calling slide number 8? Would this be a good time?
Yes, it would. So if you look at this, you see the athletes there in Vancouver celebrating the medals they received: gold, silver, and bronze. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the United States won more of those medals in Vancouver than any other country in the world, which, of course, we were pretty pleased about. And then I thought, well, let's just look at how the United States does in science. So if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that instead of being number one in the world, Finland is number one in the world, then Japan, then Canada, then Australia, and the United States is way down the list. These are just the countries who have won at least one medal. That's the only ones that are up on the screen here. And so the United States, as compared to other medal-winning countries, is way down the list, and that's in science. And then if you go on to math, we're at the bottom of that list. So instead of being number one, we're next to last on this list. If you went on to the math slide there. So that's a way of saying that, look, America once had the best educational system in the world. If you go back to 1960, 1970, there's no question that more of our students were graduating from high school than in any other country. Our students were the ones that people were looking to America for educational leadership. But the rest of the world has caught up to where we are and surpassed us. We are now at the average level in terms of high school graduation rates. Our high school graduation rates haven't gone up since 1970, and other nations have now moved way ahead of us. So we're now at the industrial world average. We're no longer at the top. So that sort of motivates a lot of what this book is about. How did a once great system become a very average system? And I think that's what a lot of the school reform is about. That's what President Obama has articulated, that exact same concern. So if that's the case, what produced it? Then I don't think there's any one person that you can blame it onto. It's just a set of forces that bureaucratized our system and centralized power and have left teachers very frustrated in their classrooms. They don't feel like they're in control, and they've left students very frustrated because they don't see schools being focused on their needs and their concerns. And that leads me, Steve, to the next slide there where I talk about co-production. And co-production, if you go on to the co-production, if I can just explain that concept for a second here, is getting unpaid people who aren't being paid to do the work that is otherwise being done by paid people. And that is a trick that industry has been working on for many, many years, to make money by getting unpaid people to do the work previously done by paid people. So what they do is, Walmart is a wonderful example. If you go to the next slide, you can see the people all bringing all the goods to the counter, and they store the stuff on their shelves at home, so Walmart doesn't have to store the stuff in there. Walmart has a principle: we don't want anything on the shelf for more than 24 hours. So they want us all to buy large packages that we store in our own closets so that they don't have to. That's Walmart getting unpaid labor to do the work of paid labor. And here's, if you go to the next slide, this is everybody going to an ATM. The banks are great at getting us to do their work for them, or the airlines are just as good if you go to the next slide. So so if you look at education, in education, you have to get unpaid labor involved. You have to get the student involved. You have to get the family involved. You have to get the peer group involved. If you get all that unpaid labor involved in the educational system, you're going to have a dynamic educational system. But if you go on to the next slide, that's not what we've been doing. We have been putting more and more paid labor into our educational system so that the number of professional people per 100 students has doubled since 1960. We had 6 professionals per 100 students back in 1960, and now today we have over 12 professionals for every 100 students. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that the number of staff people per 100 students has also doubled from less than 2 to nearly 4. So you have had a huge increase in the number of paid labor in our educational system in the last 50 years. So we think that we need more paid labor in order to produce more in education. But it hasn't worked because how much kids learn in school today is no greater than it was back in 1970. And the number of kids graduating from high school hasn't increased since 1970. So the cost, if you go on to the next slide, has gone way up. And class size has gone down. So the green line shows you the rising cost of education in the 20th century. From a very low level back in 1920, this is in real dollar terms, this is not inflation, but just a steady increase in the cost of education, and then a decline in the number of students in each class as we're trying to bring more and more professional people in there to educate children, to individualize it. So that's our dilemma. And if you look at our politics today, it reflects this long-term trend. And people are complaining about the higher cost of education, the Tea Party and all the taxes. They're just expressing their concern that somehow we're not getting what we want out of the money that we're paying for our educational services. So it's not like the people who are working in our educational system aren't doing the best they can, but we need to have a new structure. We have to have a new system, and that's why I say in the next slide we have to go to the Magic Kingdom. The Magic Kingdom is in Orlando, Florida, and that's where Julie Young is. And here's her picture on the next slide. Julie Young is there talking about her wonderful school, Florida Virtual School, the biggest school in Florida, which has the motto, and here's the motto: anytime, any place. It's on the next slide: anytime, any place, any path, any pace. And that's a very important concept because it allows their school to work with high school students at any time. They can study at night if they want to. They can study at home. They can study in the library. They can study with their friends. And they can focus on the particular approach to the material that is of interest to them, any path. And they can take as long as they want. They don't have to. The course doesn't have to end in May. It doesn't have to end June 1st. It can run over into the summer. They can start up in the middle of the year. So all of this is actually taking place in our colleges and universities at an incredibly fast rate. But it can also happen in our high schools as well.
Paul, are you taking a breather?
Now, do you have any of your folks online have a thought or a comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry that you can't see the chat that's going on, but I am going to point one out. So Connie says, a few minutes ago, she says, I'm trying to get Paul's main point. So Paul, I'm going to propose something. You tell me if it's close or refine it a little. What I hear you saying is that with the best of intentions, the school reformers that are documented in the book have ended up leading us toward a place where we're not really happy with the results. And what you're seeing is a technological change that has the promise of getting us back to things that we can agree on are valuable, that doesn't necessarily come from a reform movement, but comes from the inherent capabilities that are now available through virtual learning.
Well, what I'm argue in the book is that the school system that we have today is a long ways away from the school system that we had when the United States began to create this fantastic educational system that was so much better than anything elsewhere in the rest of the world. Now, we couldn't have stayed where we were in the 19th century. Change was going to have to occur. But the changes that did occur had many positive elements to it. I mean, we desegregated our schools, at least in theory. We opened up our schools to disabled people, at least in theory. We provided bilingual instruction to immigrant groups, at least in theory. So we brought in a lot of new principles. We've had we said we've got to have child-centered education, and we've made a lot of efforts in that direction, at least in theory. But when you look at how it all has worked out in practice, none of these groups have been adequately served. And instead, we have an increasingly costly system that seems just to have ossified, and it's so over-regulated and over-controlled, and all the interest groups are fighting over their turfs, that the education of the child just is being lost in the process. So that's point number one. And there is no single point to this book. There are two main points. One is that we we didn't get what we wanted from the reforms of the past. And the second point is technology gives us an opportunity to rethink this all over again. I could not have written this book with this happy ending or this potentially happy ending 15 years ago. But when you think of the technologies that have come online in the last 15 years, they're really remarkable. I have, if you just skip down a couple slides to slide 27, and can you show each of those elements separately, Steve? I don't know if your system has that capacity or not.
Unfortunately, once it converted it, they're all jumbled together, but I think we can recognize most of them.
You can see them all there, right? And that's all happened in the last 15 years, whether it's Google or Twitter or Apple or the laptop computer or Facebook or whatever. There's just so much there, and if you think of that happening in the past 15 years, you know the next 15 years are going to be, things are going to change even at a faster rate, because every 5 years the rate of change is faster than the last 5 years, especially in the world of communications. And you have to understand that education is really communication. That's all it is communication. And we have an ability now to say, we can teach in 3 dimensions. We can have my avatar dissect a frog's avatar. Now, when I was a kid in high school, I tried to learn about the frog, and I actually read the textbook very carefully, and I was very proud of myself. I knew where the heart was, and the lungs, and the digestive organs, and the circulatory system, and all of that. I was very proud of myself. And then the day came when we were going to dissect that frog, and it was just a total gooey mess, and that poor animal died for nothing. Now, if you can dissect a cadaver virtually, and you can if you're in medical school, there's no reason why that same technology can't be made available to high school students so that they can do dissections over and over again online without killing any amphibians. So I think there's just unrealized potential for all kinds of fantastic new ways to learn things.
So Paul, Denise asks, well, first she says she fully agrees with the notion this current school system does not adequately accommodate individual learning differences. She's concerned at an overemphasis on the promises of technology. What things will get lost? Social growth? How will the movement towards technology affect children of low-income backgrounds with less access to computers? Will it further the achievement gap?
Well, those are 2 excellent questions, and they're quite different questions. So let me try to take up each question separately. If you just go down 2 more slides there to this wonderful quote by Daniel Willingham, who's a cognitive scientist at the University of Virginia. He says that working on problems that are of the right level of difficulty is rewarding, but working on problems that are too easy or too difficult is unpleasant. And I think what's happened in our classrooms, and it's inevitably so, it's not the teacher's fault, you've got a very diverse group of students there who have very different levels of knowledge that they bring to a particular task. And so for some of them, they are working at the right level of difficulty, but for others, and I just talked with my nephew in Minneapolis earlier this week, and he said to me, he's in 5th grade. I said, well, how's school going? He's such a bright kid. And he said, it's just awful. I can't stand it. And I said, well, what's wrong? And he said, well, they're doing metrics again. We've done this. This is the 3rd year in a row. We're doing metrics. I'm tired of it. Let's go on to something else. This is totally boring. Well, he is a good example of this principle that if you're working at the right level of difficulty, it's rewarding. Now, he's a very bright kid, so he's bored. apply to the classroom setting. But there could be other students in the class who the material is way above them, so they're just confused. And so when you talk about how do you eliminate the digital divide, or how do you close the education gap, there's only one way to do that. There's only one way to do that, and that's to teach at the level that a student can learn. And the other thought that occurred to me, that in particular in the U.S. context, is how important role models have been for minority students, African American students in recent time. We've had African Americans in politics, we've had African Americans as sports stars in the entertainment industry, advertising, and all of this has had a tremendously positive effect on the acceptance of African Americans in our society, and the self-image that Black people have of their place in our society. So, but in schools, think of what it would be like if you had as your physics instructor one of the most capable African American physicists offering the course online, and that could be offered to students across the country. And you had the superb course offered by an individual who shared the ethnic background of the student. And I don't want to say African American, it could be Hispanic, it could be Asian, it could be all kinds of alternatives out there. But I think that could be those kinds of positive role models could be extremely valuable. I know of a charter school that is actually doing that in chemistry, where they have a chemistry teacher who is teaching chemistry in Spanish online to students in the state of Washington, and the school is the kids are mainly being taught in English, but in these esoteric subjects, it's valuable to have the instruction in their native tongue. So it's a very creative use of online learning that reaches out to students who might otherwise be disadvantaged.
So, Paul, in those slides,
the other
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish it.
Well, the other topic was networking. Yeah, was the social life, and I think that you want to do this on a blended basis. You certainly don't want to eliminate the high schools that we know today, but I think you want to build them more around the extracurricular activities that engage students so successfully today. So there's no reason why your teachers can't serve as tutors at school, that the learning is primarily offered online, and that you can have a mix of experiences in your high schools and material presented to you online. They don't need to be exclusive one way or the other. You can have a blended model. And you'll hear that from Julie Young, because the whole Florida virtual high school model is a blended model and she can explain how students can take courses both at their district school and online.
We've done a couple of shows with Michael Horn, one of the co-authors of Disrupting Class, and looked specifically at blended models because they also offer a fairly good solution to the current funding structures. They seem to fit in well.
Well, the costs of education are going up and up, as I said earlier, and we've got to find a way of offering better courses for less.
Out of maybe 100 people that know me.
So Royce, I think we're hearing you because you came in on the teleconference bridge. You may not know that, but you may want to. That's okay. Thanks, though. Hey, Paul, I'm interested in a lot of times people use Finland as an example. So Finland has, sort of the standard, and Finland is at the beginning of that revised academic medal chart that you show, at least on one of the charts. What has Finland done that doesn't seem to be technology driven that we haven't seemed to be able to do?
It's hard to say. are all the elements that have created the unbelievable Finnish success story? If you look at Finland, where it was in 1990, its level of performance was exactly that of the United States. And over the 22 years since then, or 20 years since then, it has steadily moved up to now being number one in the world in science and number two in math. So it's really an extraordinary development, and it's difficult to explain. I think certainly one part of it is the fact that the Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union wasn't a communist country when the Soviet Union was there, but the Soviet Union was right next door, very, very threatening, and controlled a lot of what the Finns could do. So once they were released from that, an enormous amount of energy developed within the Finnish population. So I think partly it's that. Some of my musical friends tell me that the Finns are the most musical people in the world, and that there is also a theory out there that learning a musical instrument, whether it be the piano or the guitar or the violin, is so difficult that it's a mind-expanding experience that affects your abilities in other domains as well. That's still a controversial claim, but if that's true, it is certainly true that the Finns are by far the best musically trained people in the world today. They are dominating the world in terms of musical performances as composers, as conductors, as great world-class singers. They have a symphony in every community. So it's really amazing place from that point of view. The other exciting thing that goes on in England is the way teachers are taught in ed schools. Their ed school is very unlike ours. Every ed school runs a real school. We have something like laboratory schools in many of our colleges and universities, but they're usually run as operations quite separate from the instruction of teachers or people who are going to become teachers. In Finland, the professors are actually teachers in these schools, and the students work with the teachers. You're pretty much guaranteed a job if you get into ed school. It's very competitive getting there, and you get pretty good training in that ed school. So I think those are just some guesses of mine. I can't claim that those are the explanations, but I do know this, that we can't reconstruct what the Finns are doing. All those, the only thing that we could do is perhaps rethink the way we teach teachers how to teach. I don't think our ed schools are designed to teach teachers what they need to know. And there's a lot of evidence that you don't become a better teacher by going and amassing the courses that are required in order to be certified. So certification does not lead to better teaching. So I do think that we should take a good look at what the Finns are doing when it comes to teaching teachers how to teach.
We obviously need to do a show about it. And Randall, thank you for posting the links to those articles. I hadn't seen either, and I'll definitely read them closely. And if anybody has any ideas on doing a show on Finland, I bet we could call Linda Darling-Hammond back. But if you have any other ideas, let me know. So, Paul, obviously the book is much more nuanced than you've fully had a chance to describe here. But I do want to shift to Q&A for the last 10 minutes. I do want to recommend the book. There were a lot of things that have come up in my mind that I know are addressed in the book that we just don't have time to talk about. And it is I found it a very compelling read. Really enjoyed it. So we'll now turn over to Q&A. If you have a question that came up in the chat that hasn't gotten answered, please post it again. It's easy for me to miss as those links and questions fly by. You can also raise your hand by clicking on the hand with the green up arrow, and then I'll give you the microphone. If you haven't tested your microphone and it doesn't turn on, we'll have you go up to Tools Audio and run the Audio Setup Wizard. So do we have a brave first question for Paul? Okay, so Bill has raised his hand. Bill, I'm giving you the mic. Go ahead. And Bill, I don't know if you've done this before, but you click on the larger microphone button at the lower left of your screen to turn your mic on.
Thanks, Steve. You hear me okay now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Paul, you talked about No Child Left Behind and what it's done to ossify education. Can you talk about the race to the top and where does that fall in the whole process?
Well, I am not going to say bad things about race to the top, but I do feel it's part of the increasing centralization of our educational system. I don't think it's going to solve the problems. I was disappointed that there was very little attention to digital learning in that undertaking, and it's basically asking states to spend a lot more time worrying about what the federal government wants and how they can comply with this. I found it totally fascinating that New Jersey failed to win it because they didn't get the right figures in the right place in the forms. And to me, that's just a symbol of the bureaucratization of our educational system. So I think it's really an extension of No Child Left Behind. It's not an alternative to it.
And Paul, you do talk at some length in the book about the difference between how things get measured and what the results they produce. And you can't see, but Bill's clapping for your response, so he did indicate that back. But I feel like you do cover a fair amount of that in the book as well, right?
I do, and the accountability idea, I can see where it comes from, because once you have a centralized system, the teacher no longer feels like he or she is in charge, and so they sort of give up. And then somebody else says, well, the teachers aren't holding the students accountable. Well, they can't because they're so hemmed in by all the regulations. So then somebody else says, well, we've got to hold them accountable. And then the states come in and they say, oh, we've got to have these tests. And then the federal government comes in and says, no, we don't like your tests. You got to have our test. And you got to do it our way. So, and now we have to have national standards because we don't like the state standards. So it's just inevitable that once you start no longer allowing each local school to operate in its own way and let students choose with how they want to learn, you're going to get into this highly centralized system that's going to get very bureaucratized.
So, Chris, I apologize, Chris135, if you've asked a question that I missed here. Is the question, Paul, I think it is, Paul, how relevant do you find standardized tests? Well, in the world of digital learning, you will be using standardized tests because they can be used in a diagnostic way to identify how at what level a student is what the current knowledge of a student is. So I am not opposed to standardized tests. They are very efficient ways of gathering information about how well a particular person is doing. But it's what's the purpose of them? Is the purpose to provide the information that a student is now prepared to receive? Then they can be used very effectively. If it's to reach sort of judgments as to what to do with a student, well, then it's being used for a different, not necessarily the right purpose. Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Again, feel free to raise your hand using the hand with the green up arrow or put the question in the chat. Tim asks, how do you reverse this trend of standardization, centralization to empower greater student choice given the structures that are now in place? What would the first steps be? Well, that's a good question, because what I think you want to do is to first of all say to every high school student, you can take whatever course you want, provided it's an accredited course, and apply it to your high school diploma. You can take it from your local high school, or you can take it from one of a multiplicity of providers. And the state will pay the provider if you select that provider for the course.
So right now we have Middlebury College offering language instruction to high school students. I don't see any reason why a student in Vermont or a student in Massachusetts or anywhere else in the United States should not be able to take their language instruction from Middlebury College. It's known for its excellence in that field. It's got to have high quality courses if it's going to keep its reputation intact. So once you allow students to take their courses from whomever has an accredited course out there, you're going to put the student in charge, and you're going to have tremendous competition among colleges and universities to show that they can come up with the best possible courses for high school students. And then once you get it in place for high school students, you can begin to think about middle school as well.
Okay, our final question is going to be asked by Nathan. Nathan, I've given you the microphone. To turn your mic on, click the larger microphone button at the lower left of your screen.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, great. My question is, we seem to be talking a lot about structures impeding what we want to achieve in education. Will we need to develop things outside of our structures? In other words, the change will come from teachers and in events like this, I assume. So how do we create change when the structures themselves prevent us from changing?
Well, it's a hard question to answer because there are lots of vested interests in the status quo. There will be people who don't want to accept learning online. They won't want to accept putting students in charge. And the resistance to that is going to be significant. But once the potential of digital learning becomes apparent, and it is becoming apparent today in our colleges and universities, it's going to spread very quickly. It is the case that 1 out of every 5 students in our colleges and universities today is taking a course online. And they're not necessarily the best. I don't want to claim that we have the best online courses today. I don't think we do. I think we're in the very early stages of development. We're going to have a lot better courses in 5 years than we do now. And in 10 years, they're going to be a lot better than that. But once the quality of those courses become fully apparent, and they are getting better with every passing year, then I think it's going to be very difficult to stop this innovation.
Okay, just quickly in closing, so does that mean that we need to address in teacher training courses things such as learning how to create good online content and how to engage students and parents, as we've discussed, in creating learning experiences?
I think you should need to be taught how to identify good online content and how to access it. I think that the people who are going to be producing good online content are going to be teams. I don't think any one teacher can do it. I think it's got to be done by a team that's got all kinds of resources that they're bringing together to create the course. So there's got to be a big investment of resources up front to really create a high-quality course. And then once the course is in place, then you can use teachers as tutors and coaches to help the student with the course that's been created.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to finish there. I'm going to clap for you. You're not going to see the clapping, but the audience is now clapping for you. The book is Saving Schools. Really, so appreciate your coming on tonight. Appreciate your being a part of the series and adding your voice in this just particularly thoughtful book that I enjoyed so much. Any last words?
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you to all those who participated in their questions, because I thought that was a very on-target conversation. Thanks so much.
Most appreciated. Thanks again to Learn Central and Illuminate for providing the platform and for my employment. And then remember, coming up Thursday, Ben Daly on High Tech High, and then next week on Monday, the Elevating the Dialogue on Educational Policy with the group from Edutopia, including Alfie Kohn, Will Richardson, Gary Stager, Deborah Meyer, and others. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a great night.
Good night.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
night. Thanks, Nathan. Good questions.